tatlong nawawala daw dito sa ano. Kayo yung tatlong nawawala. Pinaghahanap na kayo. Kaya nga. Sabi na. Ay, sarap kumain ulit ng taho.
Masih ikut ke sana.
Parang niya na ano. Meron naman siyang sombrero eh.
Oo, tama pa ganyan. Nung sa atin din yung mga atan ng Japanese.
Mga Japanese, Spanish. Nawawa lang sila.
Mahirap din.
Kaya tinangutawag sa atin lalo. Kasi may nung time ng Japanese.
Bring it on. Pero iiwanan ko.
Yeah. I think that's put out from that's why they probably got cancelled. Welcome aboard the Morona for your harbour cruise. Just a brief safety announcement. Now please be aware that there are life jackets in the marked compartments at the front of the vessel as well as upstairs, and in the event of an emergency please take direction from the crew. Thank you. Now this settlement of Port Arthur of course was a notorious prison, officially a secondary punishment station, a place where they incarcerated what were considered to be the most incorrigible or incurable criminals within this colony of Van Diemen's Land. Now the general scheme of this place of course was that men would be put to hard labour gathering raw materials, and other men would be put to task making things from those raw materials. Port Arthur always had an industrial side. Now the most plentiful and most valuable raw material here was timber. Various species of eucalypts which were described as being 150 feet to the first branch. Convicts produced anything from broomsticks to boats and ships, and this clearing we're coming alongside on your left hand side is the dockyard where they produced around 200 vessels altogether. The majority of these were longboats or whale boats. Whaling was a major industry in this early colony of Van Diemen's Land, so you can imagine craft like that being in big demand, and ships would travel from all over the world to hunt in these very fertile waters. A longboat is a very similar craft, but they were used to transport goods and personnel around the bays and inlets of this early colony, when travel across country was often quite difficult, if not totally impossible. But they built larger ships as well. The largest ship built at Port Arthur was 286 tons. She was also the largest ship built in the colony at that point in time. And what you can see sitting in one of the old slipways is an artist's sculptural representation of one of those craft under construction. Now the operation at the dockyard was fairly independent of the rest of Port Arthur. They had their own blacksmith shops where they could make their own metal fittings and fastenings. They had their own saw pits. They used to use steamers. Steamers allowed the timbers to be heated up, makes them more pliable so they can be bent to the appropriate shapes. Up the back of that complex was a big shed where they used to cut and sew the canvas sails as well as make up the rigging. And of course all of this was under the watchful eye of a master shipwright, the first being John Watson and later David Hoy, who used to live in that white weatherboard building, one of the oldest surviving wooden buildings in Port Arthur. Now there was never a problem with the quality or quantity of produce here. The major problem was the ships were very well built, but they were also very cheaply built. They were often sold on the open market for what would be, for a private shipwright, almost cost price. And you can understand that these private entrepreneurs were a bit upset by that. They protested through the Lieutenant Governor's Department and finally had their case heard that they couldn't compete with convict labour in a settlement like this. So eventually the dockyard was closed down in 1848, but not before they had produced 200 boats and ships, and they also used to carry out very handy and timely repairs to any ships around the coast experiencing difficulty. Now it's quite a pleasant walk around to the dockyard. You just hop onto the road above the jetty, walk along a nice tree-lined avenue and you were there. I recommend take your camera because there are some lovely images to be captured looking out across the bay. The settlement you can see in front is called Carnarvon. It originally started as a few fishermen's shacks and weekenders, but it is a residential area now. But it was actually the site of their brickfields where they used to gather the clay and fire their bricks. They could make tens of thousands per month if it was necessary, and it quite often was. If you keep on following that road, you can make it to Safety Cove, which is an absolutely beautiful beach, and further on, of course, is the lookout and remarkable cave. Not much of a detour, but it's well worth the look. Now we're travelling towards a headland which is called Point Puer. It's spelled P-U-E-R, which is Latin for youth or boy. It was named as such in 1834 when they established a specifically designed juvenile prison here. It was the first sanctioned juvenile prison under British control, and the average age of a convict was around 12 to 15, but the youngest of them were only 9 years of age. They were the pickpockets, the petty thieves, who came from the larger industrial towns of Great Britain, but the majority seemed to have come from London and the London districts. And they were the artful dodgers, but very much the real thing. People are often appalled at the fact that they were transporting children as young as 9. And the sadder fact is that the age of responsibility in Britain at this time was age 7. Boy or girl caught and convicted could be thrown into jail at that age, but the problem was that there's the same jails for everybody, men, women and children. These places were grossly overcrowded, they were rife with corruption, and the thinking people of the day figured that these young people were actually learning more about the ways of crime within the walls of the prison than they were on the outside. They called these places universities of crime. Lieutenant Governor Arthur was made aware of a similar circumstance with boys being transported to Van Diemen's Land and spending considerable time in the Hobart Barracks in contact with established criminals. So the idea of Point Puer was born, and ably assisted by his commandant, Captain Charles O'Hara Booth, they set about trying to change the system. The idea, of course, prime purpose, was to keep the boys well away from the corrupting influence of adult convicts, and particularly those at Port Arthur. They could be taught how to read and write, basic arithmetic, taught trades like carpentry, boot and shoemaking, barrel making, a bit of boat building in the early days, stone cutting. Now most of the stonework in the Port Arthur Church and Military Guard Tower would have been carved by these boys, and we assume it's the rougher work that you'll see on the inside of these buildings rather than the finer work on the facings. Of course, they received religious instruction as well. This was moral reformation, and it was compulsory throughout the entire convict system. And once a boy was considered suitable, he could then be taken to a hiring depot, which was out at Newtown, and from there distributed throughout the colony as a useful worker. So they were trying to steer the boys onto a different path, and with their new trade, they're hoping they won't resort to their old trade again and will become an integrated member of the society of these new colonies. Some boys certainly grasped that opportunity, unfortunately others didn't. For them it was hard labour, solitary confinement, deprivation of rations and corporal punishment. punishment was part of Point Poor, but thankfully never to the degree that it was applied back at the main settlement of Port Arthur. As we go past this little beach, you can see a stone wall. That's where the saw pits were, and up through the bush you can see a few foundations and footings. This is all that remains of what was quite a large establishment. Most of the buildings had stone or brick foundations, but the upper parts were made out of timber. And when they abandoned this site in the 1840s, they actually dismantled the buildings and recycled the raw materials. Problems with Point Poor was about resources and the fact that it was such a cold, windswept place. All resources had to be taken over there, and this includes water even, all the materials for their trades, rations, etc. So this almost